Howdy folks, welcome to Georgia's Smoky Mountain RC, and today we are going to build the amazing Puddle Star from Twisted Hobbies. This thing comes in a pretty thin little box, but don't let that fool you. This build does get a little bit complex, so this will be a detailed build. But this is a great little airplane. It can go in water, you can fly it in the air, you can land it on pretty much any surface, and is definitely a pretty excellent aircraft. Once it's together, this plane flies really awesome. One problem I did have was balancing it. I had to put about a ½ ounce of weights in the front, and I attribute that to the coverings I put on the horizontal stabilizer and the elevator, because they say put coatings, when you're doing the water bug build, you're going to take it on water, and I'm obviously taking it on the water. They said just coat the bottom only. Well, then that warps it up. If you really get a good enough finish that the covering sticks, it's going to warp. So I put it on both sides, and in the end, I don't think I needed it, and it made it heavier, and I had to put weights in the front. So when you go and look at the build, the one thing I would suggest you do a little differently, and it's up to you, is to not coat the horizontal stabilizer and the elevator on either side, because I think it puts too much weight on the rear of the aircraft. Now, if you're going to take it in water, if you're going to take it in water at all, you definitely need to cover the bottom, because with the way this foam is, it just absorbs the water into the little crevices. And if you dip one of the wings, your weight and balance is gone. So you need to try to keep it dry, even though it's made to go in water. That's the only drawback. But it flies great. Just make sure you do cover the bottoms to seal them. And let's get on with the build. So the first step is to fold back all of the control surfaces and put some weight on them and leave it like that for a few hours. I actually did mine overnight. That's just so that it can loosen up the joints so that they can bend back and forth very easily as you set up the control surface controls. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to cut out the fuselage doublers and the wing mount cross members, as well as these 4 little circle pieces, which is going to be used to hold a magnet. Okay, so the next step is going to be to glue the magnets into these little pieces. And the magnets are inside the parts bag, and you'll know which ones they are because they're the ones that have all the parts stuck to them. Okay, magnet number 1. Oh, the hardware's stuck to these things. Pretty strong little magnets too. Magnet number, oops, wow. That really, they came together really well. So now what we want to do is put the magnet inside the piece with the larger hole. And we want to use some thin CA. And just put a dab around here. Just use something non-magnetic to kind of hold this in place. The CA, make sure it's spread all the way around. Okay, once that's in there set, use a little bit of kicker, gives it dry faster. So once you've done this with both magnets, notice that one side is going to be flush, and as I'm seeing here, keep them away from each other. These things have a lot of pull, they'll pull together at a heartbeat. So make sure they're, you have it nice and flush on one side with both the magnets. And then the next step, we're going to take the smaller, the wood piece, round piece with a smaller hole, and that's going to attach to the side that's flush, where the magnet is flush. Because later when this goes in the fuselage, this smaller hole is what's going to be facing out of the fuselage. And we're just going to glue that in with some thin CA, like that. And you want to repeat the process for the second magnet. So to install the magnets in the fuselage, you need to go and clean out the area where the magnet goes, this small piece of foam. Both sides is the same way, a small round piece of foam here. And just need to trim out the little connecting pieces so we can get that out of there. And we're going to do that on both pieces. Now I've pre-mixed a really small amount of 30-minute epoxy. I like using this stuff wherever possible because it bonds and holds really, really well. And I'm just going to put a small amount of that inside the hole where the magnet's going to go. Then we're going to insert the magnet, making sure that the smaller hole is facing the outside of the fuselage, the larger hole facing inside. I'm just going to plug that right into the hole. There we go. And that should be flush with both this side and the underside. Both sides should be flush. So now that I have the magnets installed in the fuselage, what I've done is used my trusty little steel 1-2-3 blocks to just hold it vertical. That way there's no chance of them sliding out of the hole or becoming uneven while the epoxy dries. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to waterproof the plane. Because this is a seaplane, it's going to, of course, going to be on water, and they're saying that we want to do what's called a water bug build. Now, they say you don't need that. They call it the grasshopper build if you don't need to waterproof it because you're not going to be really flying it on water. Well, don't know how many cases we really need to build a seaplane if we're not going to take it on water. Fortunately, there's lots of body of water, including the pool, right around here that I can fly the plane. So definitely want to waterproof it. So what you're going to need to do is get some covering that is clear. They call it a laminate, but this is actually, skin that you can use on a Boss aircraft. And I got this laminate material or skin covering from Loft Hobbies. There wasn't a whole lot in stock in many other places, and I've already tried this out. It works quite well. And what they say to do in the directions is to try out a piece of test foam, which I did here. And I have my little iron for applying coverings to planes. And I did a test. I did a test at 220 degrees and 245 degrees. 220 degrees was pretty good. It started to adhere fairly well to the foam, but it wasn't really solid. It was fairly easy to pull off. So I went ahead and heated it up to 245 degrees. And for this very weak piece of foam, it kind of warped the foam just a little bit because it started shrinking a little bit. So it might be worth it to bring the heat down slightly under 245, but I think I'm going to go ahead and run it at 245. And they say to do one side of the elevator and stabilizer. And I think I'm going to go ahead and do the bottom side and then see if there is any warpage. And if there is, I think I'm just going to go ahead and coat the other side. That way they're pulling from both edges and they'll be straight. But we'll see how that goes. And so you do the bottom of the elevator and you do both of the sides. Now, when we do the sides, laminate the sides, we do not want to cut the material out around the little grooves, because when we put the bottoms in, that laminate can go over with the heat, the iron again, to laminate to those little pieces to help cover that whole area. So let's get started with the ironing. All right, we are now ready to laminate our piece. So the first thing you want to do before starting a laminate is make sure that your surface you're adhering the covering to is clean. Make sure there's no dust or debris on there at all. Then you want to put the glue side down, shiny side up, and then we can start ironing. And the idea is to get it just hot enough to get the glue to adhere to the foam, but not so hot that the covering starts shrinking tight, which it's made to be able to do that if you heat it enough. So right now my iron is at 241 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'm going to go ahead and just put this directly on here and start ironing. And you kind of want to work from the inside moving out. That is adhering quite well. So when you're adhering to the bottom, you'll see that the groove for the hinge area is opened up from the bottom forward. We're eventually going to cut this down and cover into the groove. But you want to make sure you're covering the bottom. So I think no matter what, to get the film, the laminate, hot enough to stick, it's going to cause a little tiny bit of warpage in the styrofoam. So I'm going to go ahead and do both sides. Now you could turn the heat down to the 220. I just didn't see that it was sticking well enough at 220. So the next step, what you want to do before we do the other side, is trim closely all the way around, and then cut down the center of the groove for the hinge area and around the area where the the elevator splits away from the stabilizer. And then we're going to iron down all these edges. So I got the bottom side covered and ironed down into the groove and into the slots and the notches. And it turned out really well, but it does warp just a hair amount, and I really don't want the warpage, so I'm going to go ahead and do the exact same thing and put the laminate on the other side as well. So I'm going to add skin covering to the top side, and that should straighten it out. So now we're going to laminate the sides of the fuselage. And again, we're going to trim this right at the edges all the way around, but we're not going to trim out the notches. And I'm going to do both sides. So now both fuselages, the sides are now laminated, and I did not trim around the little notches, and I didn't go over the edges with the iron yet. So all I did was laminate to the sides for both left and right fuselage panels. So before we go to install the doublers, both the foam doubler and the wood doubler, which will sit on the sides of the airframe, or sides of the fuselage, and will sit like this, and then this one will sit over top the servo areas like this. But before we do that, we need to cut out the foam areas for the servos and the little slot here, and then cut out all the slots in the fuselage before we start going any further. So you have to be very careful, use an X-Acto knife to trim with the lamination on here, to trim around each one of these, and where necessary, possibly go in with the iron and iron down any areas that look like they might pull up the material when you're finished trimming everything out. So now the foam doubler is going to sit right here. You see, here's the side of the fuselage, here's the little magnet that was put in earlier. The foam doubler is going to sit right in here. It's going to line up just with the edges and with the top surface right here. And this hole here needs to line up, and that's going to be glued down. And then the next step will be to glue the wood doubler on top of that, which also follows that same pattern. Several options here. I wouldn't recommend CA for this. There's foam tack. They talk about welder's glue. I'm going to use just regular old 30-minute epoxy because it gives you a time to work with it. And it's also rather thick, so as it starts to dry, you can kind of maneuver this to position exactly the way you want it. And then after that, I'll weight it down to hold it in place until the epoxy dries. And it has to happen the exact same thing for the other side of the fuselage as well. So now that I have the epoxy evenly distributed and everything lined up just right, I want to use some nice steel 123 blocks or some other type of weights that I can set on here to help hold everything in place while it's drying. So the next piece is gluing on the balsa wood doubler, and it's going to sit on here kind of like this, and make sure that the servo cutout areas match up, and that these edges match up, the curved edge matches up. When glued, it's going to look like this when I've already epoxied this one on. This is what it's going to look like once it has both the foam doubler and the balsa wood doubler glued on there. So now we're going to go ahead and put some glue on this piece. So don't forget to put some weights, and again I'm using my steel 123 blocks, and just putting those on there to hold pressure while the epoxy dries. So while we're waiting for these for this glue to dry, I'm going to go ahead and get this wooden piece here. Should have already been cut out. And nope, sorry, not that piece. This piece with the holes. They both actually should have been cut out, but this is the one with the holes and has a little slot in the top. So get that piece, and then we'll get into the bag of parts and pull out this piece. Looks like this. Looks like both sides, whether you're looking from the top or bottom, they look the same. So it looks like orientation doesn't matter. And then there's two screws in here, kind of like self-tapping screws. They're the two largest of this type. There should only be two of these, so it should be easy to distinguish which ones these are. And I'm going to pull both of those out. Okay, so then we're going to use these screws to put this piece onto the wood, and then we're going to have to cut the backs off so that it's flush once the screws are in. So now that I have this attached, I want to basically cut these screws off so that they're flush with the wood. So I'm going to try just using a grinding wheel, being very careful not to hit the wood, and see how that does. So that worked perfectly smooth. So the next thing it says is to put a little bit of CA glue on here to help lock the threads in, and use a little kicker. So I'll go ahead and do that next, and then we will move on to the next step. So now we're going to pre-assemble part of the battery box. So find these pieces, and we need to trim the little connecting pieces in between and just kind of clean them up a little bit. And then I'm going to use some foam tack to assemble these three pieces together. Notice one piece has a hole in it, and we will use this as an indicator to know which side which piece goes on. So the best way to figure this out is put the piece with the hole right here, the hole facing this side, and then the centerpiece, which is the one that has the slots, not the notches, or the notches, not the pieces that stick out. And if you do it one way, it's too big, it doesn't fit properly. Do it the other way, it would fit snug like so. Okay, then the other side, of course, has this little notch right here, and that fits perfectly like this. So what you want to do, use some good old foam tack, or you could use epoxy or the welder cement, whatever you'd like to use here. And this piece will fit in like this. And this piece will fit in, again with the hole right here, will fit in like this. And what you want to do is just go ahead and glue this together. When you let it sit, to make sure it's perfectly vertical, you can always use a 1, 2, 3 block. Probably have to put one on each side to be able to keep both sides vertical, and then put some on the outside, or some combination to help keep them straight while they dry. So before moving on, we need to make sure that the servos fit into the slots. Each fuselage side has 2 slots, of course, here, and the second one here and here. And we need to make sure that the servos can fit down inside, and you can see it's kind of tight. They don't really fit. There's a little slot here for the, for the wires. So what you need to do is take an X-Acto knife and clean up the wood area a little bit, maybe even the foam a little bit, until they can fit down into the slots nicely. Now take the remaining styrofoam pieces that are part of the bulkhead and separate them and clean them up so they look as like these pieces shown here. This is the battery box we've already put together. And notice the other pieces. And only one piece has yellow on it, and that will line up with this notch in the fuselage, because you can see from the outside looking this direction, and that's why you'll see the yellow. So what we need to do is put all these pieces into one side. We want to dry fit them first. Put these into the side of the airframe. So the battery box sits right here in the front, right there. And this piece, which can be a little confusing, sits right here. This little notch down here on this edge of the battery box. And it's going to plug right in like so. Then notice this piece of the bulkhead balsa wood is going to go with a notch facing towards the lower side of the aircraft. It plugs in here. And then this one, you want the little 2 hooks coming off the bottom facing down, and there's a little notch in the top that goes near the top. And that is going to plug in right here. Again, dry fit, don't glue yet. That piece sits there. And again, the yellow you want facing this direction. And that plugs in here. Well, it sits right there. Then we have the front bulkhead, which there's two different size notches. So of course the larger notch is near the top. So that's going to sit there. Then we have this piece. That's going to go back here, kind of over the edge. It also has two different size holes for the notches. It's going to go right over the edge of the foam doubler that we put on earlier. Then this is for the tail section. It's going to sit back here. You'll notice that the forked area comes over here near where it's drops down on this side. This last piece right here goes with the two slots near the top and plugs in right here. So when you're all finished, this is kind of what it's going to look like with all the dry fitted pieces. Again, notice that the small piece sits right here, up like this. The smallest piece goes there. So here's what it looks like when the pieces are all dry fit together for both the left and right fuselage. One thing that's helpful before doing the dry fit is to work these two wooden pieces into the the balsa on each side really well. Make sure they fit really well before doing the dry fit, or you'll have to do a little cleanup before you do the final fitting to glue everything together. So now we're going to dry fit the two bottom pieces of the aircraft, two remaining yellow pieces. And they're going to sit, of course, on the bottom side of the aircraft, like so. This will slide into the two slots here, and into all the slots along the left and right sides, and then the front of the aircraft will sit in here like so. Okay, so once the tops and bottoms are all dry fitted, we'll see how the pieces come together across the bottom, and then once it's glued, these two pieces will meet here in the front. And it comes back here to the back, and if we flip it over, you can see how the front comes together. And this piece in the front has a slot, kind of a slit on the underside of this piece, so it'll fold up as it plugs into the slots for the nose of the aircraft. And then you can see how the piece back here kind of fits in. So once everything is good and snug, take it, and happy with everything, take it apart and then start gluing the pieces in all on one side first. Get all the bulkheads glued on one side solid first before moving on to adding the other side of the fuselage. Both set up with the thin CA. I'm going to go ahead and add my epoxy that I've already mixed up. And again, I'm not going to put any near the top surfaces up here, nor the surfaces on the inside where the wing goes. This one actually can go all the way around, but this one, I'm just going to put the epoxy on part of the areas. But I really want this to be strengthened up really well. So while the balsa cross members are drying, I'm going to go ahead and start to put in the battery box. So I'm going to do another little dry fit here. Make sure everything lines up okay. And then we have this little reinforcement piece that goes right in here. So make sure that lines up okay. And it looks pretty good. So what I'm going to use here is foam tack. So the next one I'm going to put in is the piece here. Notice that the yellow is coming out the area that comes down, because when you look at the aircraft from the bottom, this will be shown. So you got to make sure the yellow is in the correct place. And I'm just going to go ahead and foam tack this in, and then use the 1, 2, 3 blocks to hold it nice and vertical. So notice I have this piece foam tacked in, and that the yellow piece is definitely extending out this side. So when the bottom is on, it will look like this. Now I'm going to attach the forward bulkhead with some foam tack. And this one's pretty easy to know how it goes on, because it has, the slots are 2 different sizes, so that makes it pretty easy to know exactly how that's going to plug in. So let's go ahead and glue this on. So now I'm going to glue in this little bulkhead piece here, and the 2 slots in this are to hold the tube that the control linkage will go through. One tube will be here, one tube will be here, and there's also slits over here in this piece that also hold the tube. And I haven't glued that one. I'm going to glue this one as well and get those in place. So now I have all the pieces except one that are glued in and ready for all the bulkhead pieces, but I'm not going to do the one here in the back yet. I'm going to wait and do that at the end and do both sides at the same time, because when it goes together, it comes back towards a bent to be narrower on both sides of the fuselage in the back, which means if they both bend back that way, that this can't be straight. So that's going to have to be turned a little bit on each, and if I glue it flat now and then go to put the other piece on, then it's going to be flat on one piece and at an angle on the other, and I want it to be the same on both. So we'll save this until later. Everything else is in place. So now what I want to do is do another dry fit, and then after the dry fit, what I'm going to do, if everything looks good, is I'm going to put foam tack on all the foam surfaces. I'm not going to put any glue at all yet on the wood pieces. I'm going to put it all together with a foam tack and do the wood pieces, the glue for those afterwards. So after doing the dry fit, I realized that I don't want to put glue on these 2 pieces either, because they also have to have the fuselage pulled together. And the foam tack dries, it dries pretty quickly, so we don't want to have any pieces dry without being properly in place. So the only thing I'm going to put glue on initially is the bulkhead here with the yellow at the bottom, the front bulkhead, and the battery box area. And then I'm going to put it together, tape that in place to let it dry really well. Then later we'll come back and glue the wood, these 2 back bulkheads, and the bulkhead by the tail end of the aircraft. Now we're going to glue these 2 pieces here and here with foam tack. Put those in at the same time, getting this to kind of stay roughly where I want it to be. And then I'm going to go ahead and use CA to initially tack this joint and this joint. And then after that, we'll go ahead and put a little epoxy on these 2. Okay, so I'm going to put a slight bit of epoxy on here now to get these two surfaces strengthened. So now I need to put this rear bulkhead piece in on the tail section. And to do that, because when I put this in, it's going to squeeze these pieces together like so. And I want to make sure that it glues in a way that keeps the form as close to the desired amount as possible. So what I'm going to do is temporarily dry fit this bottom piece in again. I'm not going to run it fully in yet. Just going to dry fit enough of it to grab the form that we want. Bring it up to about here, and I'm going to put on a piece of tape. Just tack this on lightly just to hold this part in place. Just always be careful when taking the tape off to pull it at an angle as to not to pull the covering off the sides that we put on earlier. So now I'll put the rest of this form back in once we glue this piece in. So I'm going to use some foam tack and put that on both sides of this piece. And this has a nice little fork in the top, and that fork is so that all the linkages can run through there for all the control rods. Okay. Foam tack dries pretty quick, but not so quick that we can't handle it a little bit to get everything exactly the way we want it here. So make sure that the fork is facing up towards this beveled edge, like so. And let's plug that in. On both sides. Again, we're not gluing the bottom at this point. We're just using the bottom to help hold the form. I want to make sure the whole tail section doesn't slant to one side or the other when I'm gluing this together. Okay, make sure that's glued in just right. So as you can see, there is a slight angle on both pieces, and this will help to, gluing the bottom on will help to keep everything together in the way it will be once everything's fully assembled, so we don't have any straight pieces and bent pieces on this last bulkhead. Now the rear bulkhead is now sealed, and I've removed the tape from that area. So the next thing we're going to want to do is dry fit these pieces. You want to dry fit both bottom pieces, and when these are glued together, they need to go together in this area quickly, because otherwise this bulkhead in here will get bent and things won't line up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue about halfway down this piece and then start working on this piece coming forward, and stop the glue on this piece about right here, because I want to make sure I get these pieces fit well, and then I can finish up the rest of the areas. But these need to be dry fit to make sure everything's coming together correctly. And this is the first piece I'm going to do here. The piece that folds in here. There's a little bend with a cut in the back of the styrofoam that allows this to form around the battery box and what's going to be the window. And then when the forward piece is in and fully engaged, when bringing the bottom up to meet it, it needs to be trimmed a little bit, and trimmed at a slight angle. So to get that just right, what I'm going to do is go ahead and glue this piece first, then I'll start working on the underside. So the nose area here did not want to cooperate real well. So what I ended up having to do is use 2 push pins to hold the very end of the piece correctly in place so it's nice and even all the way across. Now that this front piece is dried, pretty much I took another look at this, and I think what I'm going to do is this is nice and square now with this just dry fitted in the front. So I'm not going to glue the front and the back at the same time like I said I was going to do. Just going to leave this dry fitted. I think that holds this piece straight enough as is. So I'm going to go ahead and just put some foam tack and glue this whole piece on in one shot. Okay, so the back half has been completed and it turned out really well. It's a bit messy. Have a few paper towels on hand when you're gluing that piece in. Now, this is dry fitted in the front and I'm getting ready to glue it, but before I do that, I want to trim this piece right here. The yellow piece here would line up almost exactly with the edge of the piece we previously glued in for the top here. However, there's basically an angle that needs to be cut with an X-Acto knife. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that angle so that this piece can now be glued on. So we want to test the electronics. First, you need to make sure you have everything. So we've got left and right motors, propellers, which we won't be using right now, left ESC, right ESC, and our adapter cable right here for the power. We have here the receiver, 4 servos. I've got all the same type for each one of the 4 servos. And then in addition to that, I purchased 2 extension cables for the motor power, the 3 wires that go to the motors, because I don't want to have the ESCs having to sit really close to where the motors are on the wings, because then you have to balance the wings, you know, and potentially add additional trim. I'd rather have those in the center of the plane, closer to the center of CG. So this is the electronic setup. We have our LiPo battery, which is going to plug into a power splitter, which is going to come into the 2 ESCs, which then hook to both to motors. So the right motor is going to plug into the throttle channel on the receiver, and then the left motor is going to plug into the gear channel on the receiver. Then I have, of course, the rudder plugged into the rudder channel, elevator plugged into the elevator channel, and then I have the right aileron is plugged into, let's see, right aileron is plugged into the aileron channel, and the left aileron is plugged into the aux channel. So all 6 channels on the 6-channel receiver are used. Now, with a few things we have to do with the radio with this setup, because the way this is set up is that when you give left rudder or right rudder, we want the motors to also help in turning. So we have to set up several mixes on the radio. We also have to get the radio initially configured so that we can program the ESCs to have full throttle range. So I'm going to add one mix pattern first, power everything, bind to the receiver, power everything up, get the ESCs working, then we'll add the second 2 mixes. So what I've done is I've gone in, I know they call this the Puddle Star, but I like calling it the Puddle Jumper, so I called it the Puddle Jumper. So for the Puddle Jumper, if we go into the settings, and the system setup, and let's go into the channel assign. So notice that everything is set up as normal. throttle channel, elevator channel. The aux channel says NA. So this screen, basically, this is an NX10 from Spectrum. And so this screen basically stays the same as the normal setup. And if you look at aircraft type, get the right direction here while looking through the camera. So aircraft type is set to wing as dual aileron. And if we look at the previous screen, dual aileron, and tail is normal. So tail is just normal, single servo. The wing has dual ailerons. So now when we go back into the aircraft, and let's go to mixing. So I only have one mix set up so far, which is to mix the aileron and the throttle and the gear, because they're both going to act as throttle channels. So you can see I have it set up to 100, 100, and then I have the switch set to on. Now, if you notice down here where it shows the control inputs, here's the throttle, here is the gear. So watch as I bring this up. Notice that both the gear and the throttle are moving together. So that's mix one. I don't want to set gear on its own separate RX channel. I left the RX channels as they normally are. So it's still set as the gear channel, but then I did a mix to cause the gear and throttle to move together. Now, while we're set up in this mode, before adding mixing, to mix in the rudder to give us left or right motor to help in turning, I want to calibrate the ESCs to be sure I have full range of the ESCs, or they will not function properly. So I'm going to exit out here, exit to the main menu, and I need to find the bind, which is right here. Go into bind, and we're not going to go into bind mode just yet. We're going to go over here, and we have the bind plug here is installed on the receiver. Okay, so the battery is plugged in and the receiver is waiting to bind. And I've gone over here and I've put the throttle to the full on position. Then I'm going to go over here and it looked like it exit out of my bind. Let me go back in there. So bind, yes, and bind.
DSMX 22 milliseconds.
Okay, so we are now bound. And I heard a beep. So I turned the throttle back down. Now what we want to do is power back down the system. So pull the battery. Okay, so battery's pulled. Remove the bind plug. And if everything works correctly, when I repower, I should have basic throttle control without rudder in the mix. So I'm going to plug the battery in. Okay, battery plugged in. Now, let's see if we get some throttle out of these engines. And we do. Both, I need to tape those down, but both engines are spinning. Well, the second mix we want here is rudder to throttle channel. And I've got that set up to 50% and 50%. So what that means is if I take the stick to the left or right, we will get a little bit of motor thrust. I've already got them both set up, but I'll show you. This is the rudder to throttle, and the next one is the rudder to gear, since the gear channel is for the other channel. So I have a switch here, which is set to be active in position 1 and 2. So if I take it to position 0, and if I take my rudder left and right, no motor action. If I activate the switch in either position, now if I go left or right with the rudder, I get one or the other motors. And I still get regular throttle when I go forward. So that's the way that it's set up. So I have my gear switch set to position 2 and 3 will be active. So -50 for gear to rudder, and then the gear to throttle, rudder to throttle. Yeah, so rudder to throttle 50%. Switch 0 makes it inactive. And again, back to the rudder to gear. Again, position 0 is inactive, and it's -50 for the rudder to gear channel. Again, gear is set to motor, to the left motor, on the left side of the aircraft. Of course, when you say left or right of the aircraft, you're always talking about from the pilot's view. So the left will be your left when you consider yourself to be in the pilot's chair. So now that's all the setup we need on the radio for right now. So I'm going to prepare the 2 aileron servos by first taking some sandpaper and roughing up the bottom of the longer single-sided aileron horn, or servo horn. Both of them. I've already done this, but you basically want to rough them up with sandpaper so they're not smooth anymore. They're kind of rough. And these are going to sit on the top of these 2 pieces, just like so. And you want to kind of just center them on there with a drop of CA to hold it in place, initially anyway. But you need to kind of rough up this area too with sandpaper. You can see I've already done this here. You just want to rough up the area just to give the glue a little bit of adhesion. And then we're just going to put a drop of CA, just a drop to hold this here initially. Then for strength, what I'm going to do is use some very thin synthetic fishing line. It's braided fishing line, so it's almost like a thread, but it's much stronger than a regular thread would be. And you just take this and you kind of glue it to get it started, and then you just wrap it around a few times and then put a drop of CA on top of that. And that will help strengthen the bond for the aileron, the 2 aileron servo arms. So this is what it should look like once it's finished on both front and back. So I have the control horns installed, and here we have the left of channel here, which is the rudder, the right channel here, which is the elevator, and then we have the 2 ailerons. So the right is hooked to the aileron channel. The left aileron is hooked to the aux channel. So you have aux, aux, aileron, and then we have rudder and elevator. All right, so I've got my rudder and the elevator servos installed. They're not glued in yet, but they are pretty tight fit, so touching them up with glue to hold them in place will be real easy. You almost don't even need the glue because they fit so firmly, but we'll add that at a later step. So what we need to do is want to insert these rods, the linkage rods, which is what the linkage will run through, and we plug them into these slots that are pre-cut in the bulkheads, and they say to center them all the way at the bottom, and it should perfectly line up. It looks like that's about right. And what I've done is I've taken the little clasps for the end of the control rod that hooks to the control horn, and I've threaded in all but down to about 1/8 inch approximately the little insert that's hollow, where the push rods are going to, your control rods are going to push into when they're glued. Now, one thing to keep a note on is if you're using pliers to hold the metal part still while screwing on the plastic ends, be careful not to squash the area that the control rod goes into, because if you bend that at all, the control rod is not going to go inside them. Then you use a little pin to kind of hold these in place temporarily, and it says to make these about 30 centimeters away from the control rod tubes. So what I've done is gone 30 millimeters, which is about the same as 3 centimeters. And I've cut a little piece of wood out of a popsicle stick, and I'm going to use that to measure the distance to the end of the ferrule here. So I'll put that in there, and then I can just slide this over so that's exactly where we want it to be, approximately 30 millimeters for both rods. And this is with the control horns on the servos centered in center position. So you're looking for 30 millimeters between the ferrule on the connecting rod to the horn to the start of these plastic tubes, the guides. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hook up my servo checker, and I'm going to go full over and verify now that with the 30 millimeters and it's fully over, that it's definitely not hitting the tube. So the tubes are aligned well, and this should work out pretty good. So now I'm just going to take a couple drops of CA and put on each one of the locations in the bulkhead. So basically 4 spots to help hold these tubes in place. Make sure no matter what you do, don't crimp or get any glue anywhere on the inside of these tubes. Just put it right in these 4 spots, and that's it. So now we want to put this, the bottom piece, and feed through the two push rod guides, and make sure that they don't get flipped underneath, that they go straight through. And we're going to, after dry fitting this, to make sure everything lines up okay, we want to go ahead and use some foam tack or whichever glue of choice to glue this piece in. So we need to take our control horns and cut them out of this fiberglass piece here. So we have the 2 control horns for the ailerons, which we'll do later. Then we have the rudder and the elevator control horns, and these are little supporting rods that'll go in the back. So go ahead and take these out. We need to trim these up really, really well. And then we're going to start putting the control horns into both the rudder and into the elevator. When cutting out these 2 pieces, there's 2 little nubs near the top here that you may want to leave because it'll help with the depth of the support arm. So I would trim everything else, but I'd leave those nubs on there. So I'm going to do the rudder first. The rudder, there's 2 different control horns for the elevator and the rudder, and the elevator has the one with the 4 holes in it. The rudder has the one with the 5 large holes in it. And that's going to insert right in here, and needs to make sure that this lines up about with where the crease is. So the way the directions show to do this is to cut this slot all the way through, put the glue in from the other side, and push the horn all the way in through to even up on this side. So that's what we're going to go ahead and do now. So for this, I'm going to use epoxy, because it's not going to dry as fast as using like CA. I want to give it time to get everything lined up just right. So I'm going to go ahead and try to get some epoxy, push kind of down into the slit for the control horn. Trying to keep it out of the hinge area here as best as possible. And I'm going to put a slight little amount onto the control horn itself here. This side in from the back to the front. So now we're going to put the horn into the elevator. So I've already cut the slot out, and we can test fit that it fits down in there snugly. And we also have to make sure that when we push it through, that it does not extend past the edge of the hinge here, the hinge area. And again, this is the one with the 4 holes on it. So what I'm going to do is put a little epoxy down into the hole and then put some epoxy directly on the horn. So I've taken away the covering on the front side and the back side where it's going to mount with the airframe. And now what I'm going to do is attach and glue the rudder in like so. And so you fold that up, slide this in, get it just about to the end, then apply the glue all around the top side and all around the piece that's being inserted. Then press down flat. So once it's glued, I want to make sure we keep it perfectly level. So I've got a couple 1, 2, 3 blocks on here, keeping the rudder nice and straight, 90-degree angle to the stabilizer. I'll just keep it that way till it dries. So this concludes part 1 of our build video. You may want to go ahead and subscribe to our channel so that you can find the part 2. Be sure to get the part 2 video. And it's well worth the build. So hang in there, keep going, and we're going to pick up in part 2 right where we left off.